I read 1,015 books in 2024 and nobody believes me, and it's starting to get on my nerves, okay? It really is. So I'm gonna walk you guys through it. How did I read 1,015 books in a year? Can you read 1,015 books in a year? Am I crazy? Am I stupid? Am I lying? Let's get into it because I don't have a lot of time and I just want this to be over with. So let's get started. For starters, I heard a lot of people say that if I read 1,015 books in 2024, that would mean I had to have read 3 books every single day, and that was impossible. Well, I'm here to tell you that it is not impossible. I have claimed on TikTok for the past year that I read 3 books a day multiple times. If you watch any of my book talk themed videos or my book related videos, I typically mention that I read 3 books a day in them. And let's roll the clips if you don't believe me. I read a lot, between 1 to 2 books a day. I read between 2 to 3 books every single day, and that is— Now, a lot of people thought that I was either reading kids books or just purely graphic novels, which that is not the case. Graphic novels are not my favorite books or anything. I did read a couple when the Color Soft came out. I read a couple of these just to see how the Color Soft translated color, and they were really pretty. But again, I only read 2 or 3 graphic novels this year, and they're just not my favorite form of reading. So no, I'm not reading picture books. I'm reading actual adult novels, and I'm going to explain all of that in a second. A lot of people also asked how long are these books that I am reading. They range anywhere from 400 pages to 800 pages. It really just does depend on the author. A lot of the books that I read are written by indie authors, and a lot of them are really, really lengthy, and some of them are a little short. For instance, Jamie Applegate Hunter wrote Viciously Yours, which is a 75,000 novel, and I read that in less than an hour. It was really good, but again, it's just an instance of an author that has a really short book. I wouldn't say that any of my books are necessarily short. A lot of them are standalones though, meaning that the book is meant to be read alone. I don't typically partake in reading longer sort of series of books during the weekday. I am a lover of mafia romance. I think I've read pretty much every single book that Neva Altaj wrote, and they're all great. I would recommend every single one of them. I just finished one actually. This was a reread because now that the year's over, I wasn't necessarily trying to get to my goal. I was rereading Stolen Touches by Neva Altaj, one of my favorites. But yeah, I read every single book that she wrote this year, and a lot of the books that I'm reading are just standalones. It's not necessarily that they're super long or super short. They're just not meant to be, like, there's not a book 2 or book 3 or book 4. Now, of the 1,015 books that I read this year, I DNF'd 10, which means I technically read 1,025 books, but 10 of them were just too much for me to finish. Now, does that mean I loved all 1,015 books that I read? Hell no. I hated a lot of them. A lot of them were just not good, but every once in a while I got a really good one. And this is just a great example. I will power through any book pretty much. That's the reason I finished 1,015 books, was I just was powering through them. Some of them sucked so bad. For instance, do you know how hard it is to read Light Lark? I hate that book more than anything else I read this year, and I still powered through it. There were 10 books I could not finish, and let me just say, it takes a lot for me to not finish a book. Like, it truly has to be a messed up form of book for me to not finish it. And how do I log these books? Because obviously, if I'm reading 1,015 books, that means I'm logging them somehow. I saw a lot of people be like, I checked your Goodreads, there were only 2 books in there. My Goodreads account is inactive for the most part. I did try to get it to work last January. However, I just found the app to be kind of complicated. I never used it prior to last year, and mine personally didn't work. I couldn't get my reading goal to update even though I was adding in books. So I just abandoned the whole thing, I think around January 31st. And I started using a different app that also wasn't working. So I ended up just logging all of my books on my notes app. Like, they're literally just on my notes app. It is a little bit harder to find the books and to figure out what I thought of them. So I did just recently, like as of last week, in preparation for my 2025 reading goal, download a new app that I'm hoping will work a little bit better. I downloaded the app Bookly, and I'm hoping that that'll make it easier for me to log my books. I don't know, I haven't used it yet. 2025, like this is the first day of 2025 and I haven't read anything yet. I also saw a lot of people saying that it's impossible to read 3 books a day. It's actually not. Now, I can read 3 books a day while I'm in school and going to classes. And I read in between class, I read I read in class, probably not great for me. Just think about it this way. Whenever you pull your phone out to scroll on social media while you're bored or waiting for something, instead of pulling up Instagram or Facebook or TikTok, I pull up the Kindle app and I read a book. That's just how I am. That's how I've always been. I've always just read books. I used to bring like 5 books to my little brother's football games because I knew I would finish them. And I've always just been a really fast reader. And it's not because I'm speed reading or skimming. I genuinely do read every single book. All 1,015 of those books were read, and some of them were even annotated 3 or 4 times. I do passes on books occasionally when I feel like I missed something. So no, I'm not skimming. I'm genuinely reading the books. It's just I read fairly quickly for someone of my age, I guess you could say. I can get into the zone where if I get some good music going, some good white noise in the background, I can sit down and I can hash out a book in less than an hour. If I'm completely uninterrupted, I can finish a book in less than an hour. And there is proof of this on the internet. I read Fourth Wing for the first time on a TikTok live, and it took me 6 hours to start the book and finish the book. And I wasn't even reading continuously for those 6 hours. I took a 2-hour break for dinner, and I think I had to do like something for my mom. So technically it took me 4 hours to read Fourth Wing, which is a pretty big book. So I don't know how fast my page speed is or anything, but I did it all on TikTok live. You watched me start that book and finish it. And then afterward, I had a discussion about the book that I read. So no, we're not skimming over here. The only time I will ever skim or skip a scene in a book is if I personally get uncomfortable with it, or it's just getting to a point where I can't deal with it. I will either put the book down and pause and I'll come back to it later, or maybe it'll be a DNF, or sometimes I will skip a spicy scene or something that I just feel like is not a good addition to the book, or it just makes me personally uncomfortable. That is the only time I skip scenes or don't read things, and it happens very rarely. I feel like I'm kind of desensitized nowadays. Now, there are only 2 genres of books that I read, fantasy and romance. I typically stick to romance standalones during the weekdays, and on the weekends, I will read fantasy books or series. Now, the reason I do this sort of schedule is because fantasy books do take me a lot longer to read, and that is because if you think about a fantasy novel, it is a book that is taking place in another world, and that is a lot to process. I can't read those as quickly as I can a romance book. A romance book is usually taking place in New York or somewhere on Earth in our lifetime, in our time place, and it makes more sense. But with a fantasy novel, it requires a lot more of my brain. I have to think a little bit more. It just takes longer. So I do read fantasy books on the weekend because I can find that I can dedicate all of my weekend to those books. I can read them fully and completely and really understand them and have time to soak them in. Now, with that being said, does that mean I don't read fantasy books at all during the week? No. I read Throne of Glass during the week this past year, and it was awesome. I loved it. I stopped at the last book, and I haven't read the last book yet. I don't know why. I think I got busy and I just never picked it back up. But Throne of Glass is great. It took me about 3 days to read all of the books except for the last one. And if I'm reading 3 books a day, you may be saying, Morgan, that means you only read like 2 books a day. There are days where I read more than 3 books. There are weekends where I stick purely to romance standalones, and I can knock 8 of those suckers out in a day. Another example is I did a reading vlog where I read for 24 hours straight, and I read 8 romance books. And I wasn't even really trying, I'm gonna be honest. I fell asleep for like 7 or 8 hours during that challenge, so we lost some time on that. But yeah, I will read more than 3 books sometimes. And I did see another comment from somebody saying that if I read 1,015 books, Fourth Wing wouldn't have been my favorite. And the truth is that Fourth Wing wasn't the best book that I read in 2024, okay? It was by far not the most revolutionary book that I read. It was not the best writing. It was not the most magnificent piece of work that I've ever read. And it was not the most magnificent piece of work that I read in 2024. But Fourth Wing did something for me that I haven't had a book do in a while, and it made me want to read more fantasy books. Over the past couple of years, I've just found a ton of fantasy books to just be either not my speed, I don't particularly care for them, they're not my favorites, because fantasy's just not it for me anymore. They're either too complicated or they're not written well enough for me to understand them or even begin to dive into them deeply. But Fourth Wing did, like, it evoked this sort of childlike sense of feeling in me. Like, it was sort of like reading How to Train Your Dragon. I've actually read How to Train Your Dragon. It's a book for those of you who've only watched the movie. But I loved Fourth Wing. I don't know if it was the dragons or what, but it was my favorite book. And was it the best book? No, there's a difference between it being my favorite and it being the best. I also read Throne of Glass this past year. That was another 2024 read. And Throne of Glass is a really, really good book and a really, really good series. I haven't read the last one yet. I promise I'm gonna get on that. It wasn't my favorite. It was a good book and it was an amazing fantasy series, but I only read Throne of Glass because Fourth Wing gave me hope that there was something at the end of the tunnel. So Fourth Wing was my favorite. And I understand that it's not the best book. I understand that Rebecca Yarros is not the messiah of reading, okay, or writing. She has a lot of work that could be done, but she wrote a good book, in my opinion. She wrote a good book, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it, and that's all that matters. One thing that I want to make abundantly clear is I don't think the average person just reads 1,000 books in a year. That's not what I'm trying to tell you. You should not be aiming to read 1,000 books in a year. I'm just a lunatic. Also, I wanted to read 1,000 books. That was my reading goal for 2024. At the beginning of 2024, I said, you know what? I'm not playing around anymore. I want to read 1,000 books this year. And I set that bar and I tried my hardest to hit that bar and achieve it. So no, I didn't just read books all year and at the end they'd be like, oh my God, guys, I wrote 1,000 books. No, I wanted to read the 1,000 books. I tried my hardest to reach that goal. So do I think realistically that a person could just wake up one day and start reading like I do and then be like, oh, I read 1,000 books? No, but I had that goal in mind and I knew that there were certain things I was going to have to do in order to hit that reading goal. And that is the difference. I feel like we're not exactly correlating this year. Is I wanted to read 1,000 books, so I worked out a system that worked for me so that I could achieve my goal of 1,000 books. Did I read every single day? No. If I read 3 books a day for 365 days, which is a year, I would have had way more than 1,000 books. I had roughly 26 days where I didn't read. If I'm logging them over the course of the year, there were around 26 days that I did not pick up a book. Now, there were some days where I read more than 3 books, and that is why I had a slight overage at the end of the year. I had 1,015 books. I was reading quicker at the end of the year than I was at the beginning. Like, my reading time has improved so, like, I'm like the Flash now, okay, guys, it's kind of crazy. Since I started doing TikTok and social media, my consumption rate has gone down a vast majority. Like, I do not consume social media content anymore. And it's just because it's hard. It's hard for me to put out videos and then watch other videos. And then sometimes there are videos trashing me on there. And it's just not easy. So I overall don't watch any kind of content anymore. I don't doom scroll on TikTok. I don't doom scroll on Instagram. I don't doom scroll on Facebook. I just read. That's my primary form of entertainment. And you would be surprised at how much time you waste on social media and watching TV and doing other little activities. I mean, some of you may have read 200 books last year, but you may be working on a craft. Like, you may be a really big crocheter and you may have crocheted a couple things and that may have eaten up some time in your day. Versus me not crocheting, I'm just reading. Like, that's all I'm doing is reading. And I don't want anybody to think that, like, you can, like, I'm trying to mislead you or lie, because the truth is, this is the truth. I read 1,015 books in 2024. That is the truth. They were not novels. They were not children's books. They were not graphic novels, manga, or whatever. They were books. They were books. I love you guys. Please stop sending me threats. Please. I have not received this much hate since I rushed, and that's crazy. But yeah. Peace. Happy reading.